questions of staff, of the project sponsor, and then maybe we'll move on to comments and things that we want to discuss. So who would like to begin? Commissioner Lamone, do I see you? Okay, go for it.
So, several of the public raised the issue of the glare and the lighting and the pilot's ability to navigate the water safely. So I for some reason, I thought that was addressed in the design. I'd just like to hear from the applicant around that and the glare issue also.
Actually, this is Pete Bowman here. So these were a number of comments that we received on the draft EIR. So these comments will be fully responded to in the final EIR in response to comments. So I just wanted to note that for the record that many of these comments that came up were items that were raised as comments on the draft EIR, and it's more appropriate for those to be responded to in that document.
Okay.
Pete, let me jump in from Commissioner Lamone. So as design guidelines and criteria, to Commissioner Lamone's comment, how will they be reflected? I understand your comment on the CEQA analysis, but how will they specifically be represented and identified relative to the controls that we would be moving forward if we do?
So you're referring specifically to the question about the lighting?
Yeah, I think it's probably a broad question.
So for lighting, we always have standard requirements that are sort of outside of design guidelines. It's just standard requirements where all of the bulbs are basically pointed downward, the bulbs are shielded, much easier now with the LED lighting that you typically see. But the idea is that you're not shooting, glare from lights off-site. Obviously, a stadium proposal is much different because you do have that field lighting. But nonetheless, all of the lights from those standards are directed down towards the field and are not directed off-site. You can certainly see them off-site, similar like you can when driving by the Coliseum for a night game. But all of those lights, where the beams, they are directed down towards the field.
Okay, back to you, Commissioner Lamone.
Yeah, and so I guess the follow-up would be, again, several of the public commented about the turning basin being sort of the primary plan to be reviewed. And, I understand that the port, I guess, still has about 7 years or so left on that option. But, would that be considered to be, outside of the scope of what we're doing here? Will it be addressed in the EIR, or is that something we can push?
So what the maritime reservation scenario covers, it covers what the site would be with the maximum take back of that land. So it's showing sort of the complete range. So right now the turning basin is being studied and analyzed by the Army Corps, I understand, with the port. And it's not for certain project that's going to be going forward in the future, but it's something that they're looking into. There may be a very high likelihood that it goes forward. But again, that is being studied. So what this preliminary development plan is addressing is the full extent of, in the event that there's no turning basin, it's the full project site as it is today. And then there's various amounts of that 10 acres that may be pulled back in order to accommodate an expansion. So what it's showing in the maritime reservation scenario is that maximum extent of what that expansion could be. So it may be somewhere in between the two. It may be just a little bit less, it may be nothing at all, or it may be that full extent. So that's really something that's unknown at this point in time until they complete that study for that separate project to decide how they want to proceed on that. So it'd be speculative at this point in time to put anything else in between. So it's really what is the baseline is as the site is today, and then showing the maritime reservation scenario, which shrinks it down to the maximum extent under that take back by the port in order to do the expansion.
Thank you, Pete.
Commissioner Fern, go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that, related to again, kind of going back to Chair Manis's question around how the guidelines respond, if it's admittedly a tricky thing to respond to because it's obviously hypothetical and we don't know how much, or all we can kind of do is state the minimum, the maximum. But does I didn't see in the design guidelines how the waterfront would necessarily be treated differently, or if it needed to be treated differently if the maritime took place? And does that need to be something that is spoken to in the design guidelines? Because at least, I don't know if I missed it, but I certainly didn't see it discussed in there as part of the waterfront district.
Yeah, so as I noted in my report, we're requesting that they provide more information on those waterfront parks, period.
Okay.
It is very much lacking in the document, and I think they need to incorporate that in. It may have been because they were not certain of what direction BCDC or State Lands wants to go with those spaces, but I think they need to put information in there that kind of guides what that development is. And the big change would be is that instead of having a wide open park with the cranes at the end, it could potentially be whittled down to being more of like a larger promenade with, park moments along the way instead of as much large open space. But it would still be of a similar percentage to the overall site area of the project. They could certainly, one of the things that we specifically asked is to clearly define that walkway. So if those parks end up shrinking down, then, some of those parks that are shown in the full plan may or may not completely go forward. But I think what the design guidelines can show is what would be the general programming of those park spaces. And if it ends up being not the full extent of the maritime reserve scenario, maybe that area just shrinks. But then those design guidelines that kind of lay out what will that park area be like would still be implemented, but maybe in a smaller square footage or area. With regard to the buildings, I'm not sure that anything would necessarily change with regard to how the building should be designed or built. I think the guidelines as they're laid out now, in addition to, the further information that we're requesting that they put in there, would still hold mostly true. Granted, some of the corridors that, the character streets that they discuss would shrink and maybe go away, but then you obviously don't need to apply those guidelines to, land that is no longer there. But once again, I mean, it is difficult to try to project to something that we don't know what that scenario is going to ultimately end up being. But I think once they incorporate a lot of the information on the parks, that could really be applied either way.
Got it. Thanks.
Pete, I just would tag on to Commissioner Fern's comment that a visualization of what that, turning basin removal area would look like, as a part of the visualization of what the maximum would be an essential part of, because, nobody knows, and you are correct in saying it, but it's a 50-50 chance that the turning basin is needed or not needed. And so in the course of at least understanding what it would look like, or at least feel like, I think Commissioner Fern is correct in at least in raising that we would really need that. And I don't feel that we would want to rely on words, because this is a very important part of the connection to that estuary. Commissioner Fern, Commissioner Lamone, other questions?
Sure, I can jump in. There's a couple.
Go, please.
Larger scale. Pete, can we, kind of tagging along with Commissioner Lamone's questions around what we heard in the testimony, and another thing that came up were the grade separations. And can you just speak about why those would not be included in these design guidelines? They do seem like they are key connections and a key issue related to access here. I'm just curious, what was the logic behind that?
Yeah, so actually, I had a discussion with one of my comments early on was actually to provide, what maybe the approach would be while going across the pedestrian walkway. What would that look like on entering the site? I mean, I think that's certainly something that could be added in there. What would the treatment be of those? If you're coming across the site, are there banners? What kind of lighting is there? I think those kind of details I think would be good things to add in. For the grade separation, I mean, at the end of the day, it's essentially going to be a roadway if it is required as part of the project. Like I said, right now it is a alternative within the draft EIR. They've responded to that to show what that would mean to the block layout within the preliminary development plan. So they do acknowledge that. And I think what might be useful if you wanted to address grade separation would be how does that underpass area look. I mean, obviously the roadway is going to be the roadway. They could address certain things. Are you going to put banners on it? What are you going to do? But I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be another, if implemented, it will be another grade separation that unfortunately, once again, kind of divides the waterfront from the area, similarly to 880, though not quite as large, obviously. But how you address the underpass of that, I think, would be something that really could be helpful in the design guidelines.
Yeah, likewise. Okay. And then talking about just shifting to height real quick. I obviously see on the proposed plan that there are two blocks that I think it's parcels 10 and 11 that are 600 feet in height, or at least proposed that way. But I thought I read in the guidelines that it just referenced a 600-foot tower. So is the concept that there would only be one tower of 600 feet? It could just go in these two different blocks, or is the assumption that both of these blocks could allow a tower that gets up to 600 feet?
Yeah, the way it is set forth in the preliminary development plan right now allows the 600 feet on two blocks. As I mentioned, I think what could be done, and I can let the applicant to speak to that if their intent was to only have one, but it is shown on two blocks within the preliminary development plan. I had not heard otherwise. But like I was saying in the presentation, I think what we can do is implement a series of tower dimensional requirements that could be built into the design guideline document that becomes more of a actual standard, similar to the setbacks from the streets and the base heights, where you take on a certain, just using one of the 600-foot blocks as an example. Maybe you say above 85 feet, here's your dimensional requirements up to 250, and then up to 400, and then up to 600, where you start cylindering the tower as it extends higher and higher. So that was just a little further clarification on the recommendation that I made in the staff report. But my understanding and what's included in the preliminary development plan at the moment is two blocks that allow 600 feet.
Okay. And then just related to that, well, not necessarily related to that, but I know staff is proposing that there would be shorter heights, and I believe that in the maritime reservation scenario, the applicant is stating that the massing and the heights wouldn't change on the blocks. And what I'm curious about is in the heights that the staff is recommending under the maritime reservation scenario, would heights need to increase, or would they also remain? Did you also do a study under that condition to verify, or at least kind of check to see if the heights could be maintained in a shorter massing?
Yes, I didn't get into that specific of a recommendation of what it means for the height if the shoreline pulls back. Okay. I think the recommendation that I have right now is that, obviously there's if you want to address height, you can always say less height, but, based on their proposal right now and what they would like to see as part of the development with the slender towers, a lot of times the slender towers are not as impactful because they do step back and create spatial separation. So if that were to be incorporated, staff thinks that would be an acceptable compromise and looks to guidance from the DRC as to your thoughts on this as well.
Got it. Okay. Jerry, I just have a couple other kind of minor questions.
Keep going, Commissioner Fern.
Right.
Keep going.
One of the questions, one of the comments that we heard from Naomi Schiff at the Heritage Alliance was the preservation of the peaker plant. I would agree that it would be desirable to keep the full thing. Do we have kind of any dimensions of what's driving the reduction? I mean, what are if it's a pedestrian kind of oriented street, how wide is it at the pinch point where the peaker plant comes in, and has that been kind of looked at and studied, and was there reasons behind saying it needs to be partially demolished?
Yeah, and honestly, I can't remember what the dimension of the pinch point is off the top of my head. I'm sure the applicant could probably throw that out there real quick. But yeah, the idea is that I mean, and I just want to clarify, the whole building would be retained. It would not be demolished. It would just be a section of the wing that would be trimmed back. And they're showing sort of the maximum extent of that, because that needs to be shown, and that was taken into consideration with regard to processing of the draft AIR and analyzing what those impacts would be. Could it be less? Potentially, yeah. And I think that would come up at the time when we start to review that and see maybe are there ways that you could maybe partially keep it and open it up where people could kind of walk through, or does it really need to pull back so that you can really make that circulation work better? I don't know if somebody from the design team wants to jump in real quick, if you have that number off the top of your head of what the pinch point is right now. Is currently designed with the existing building wall into projecting into Athletics Way.
It's, if somebody has it offhand, I don't need to necessarily look it up if it's
I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but it is roughly going from 75 feet of width to roughly half of that.
Okay.
Right. I think at its narrowest, with it's 30 feet in width. And the other consideration, it's a subtlety, but there's also sea level rise and grading adjustment issues. So historic buildings, as the whole site's being raised, add to complication. So it's dimensional, but it's also elevation and grade changes.
Okay, I appreciate that. I think a couple questions for the applicant here. One of the things I was reading about Athletics Way and the character of the street is that it should allow for diverse forms of activation. And I'm just curious, like, it seems to me that that's one of the more important streets. I understand, I think Market Street is kind of where the retail wants to be aggregated, or at least have a focus, but shouldn't this be shall rather than should along Athletics Way? I can't imagine kind of a more important area that you would want the ground floor activated. So I'm just curious what the thought was behind that.
Pete?
Yes, I think we could. Is that a question for us?
Yeah, I think it was a question for the applicant, but I do want to note that in the preliminary development plan, and this is something I had actually was going to add as a comment, and then I was trying to remember where I'd seen it. There's actually a note on the preliminary development plan where it notes the ground floor active spaces, and it's not shown in the preliminary development plan because the grade change between the rest of the site along Market and then as it moves up on the Athletics Way. But there actually is a note saying all of the ground floors on Athletics Way will be active spaces. So it will be, the idea is, I believe, to have it as active retail. But yeah, I agree with the whole issue of the shalls and shoulds. I've got a comment in there too, and I think we will work through a lot of the shalls and shoulds and leave out what we need to leave out from the design guidelines if it's already incorporated in the preliminary development plan. Obviously, there's going to be, some scenarios where there may need to be portions of the building that need to be allocated toward lobby space or something like that, but I'm sure we can work the details of that out. I'll go ahead and let the applicant respond to the specific question now.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's correct. We feel there are quite a few toggles in place in the guidelines to ensure an active pedestrian realm. We can, of course, re-examine the exact wording, but we also wanted to provide a degree of flexibility, considering that there are a lot of constraints on those blocks, and providing enough flexibility for the design to play out on those blocks as well, while ensuring enough guidelines to create an active ground floor experience.
Got it. Okay. And then just a question around mobility, micromobility. I appreciate the diagram that shows how people are anticipated to come here. And, I do get the sense, obviously, with the parking that, most folks are not going to be coming via car. But I guess what I didn't see, and maybe it was kind of alluded to in one of the greater circulation diagrams, but, I understand people coming by foot, by bike, but they also might be coming by scooter or by ride share. How is that being handled? I just didn't see how those kind of uses, because I imagine those would be overrepresented for this ballpark, would be organized and thought through on game days and non-game days, because they do affect the public realm in terms of, how those cars come and go, especially when people, you got 35,000 people trying to get out of there at the same time, and a number are going to be obviously going to be using rideshare. So I'm just curious where that's thought of. And I saw that there was a transit hub or some kind of mobility hub a couple blocks away. Is that where that's being considered, or if you can speak a little more on that thought?
Well, I'll jump in and say a few things. And Leon, if there's any other emphasis to jump into. The plans and diagrams that we're showing for all the circulation modes are at a point of full build out. As with all transportation efforts, we're building off of the intelligence and the current systems we have in place now. But as over the course of the next 5, 10 so years, things will evolve too. And so the current plan is assuming that in the first phase of the project, much of the site is left undeveloped on the west-hand side and can serve as surface parking, to allow for fans and visitors to start adapting to other modes, as the bus routes and the transit hub get established, and even more technologies like scooters and shuttles become in place. So that's the first thing. There will be surface parking in the near term. In the long term is when all of the various modes kick into play. On 2nd Street, there is a multimodal transit hub that is meant to be a connection between buses as well as the ride share along that stretch adjacent to the project. And that's been in coordination with the city and coordinating those routes and making sure they're sensible and work with the other networks. There's also pedestrian improvements and underpass improvements at Broadway and MLK in order to facilitate pedestrianization of those spaces, to make it much more appealing to be walking from downtown to Jack London and to the ballpark. And we think that with these improvements, all of these various modes will distribute the various ways that people do come here. And anticipate that diversity will only increase over time. Does that answer your question, or the team has anything else to add?
I appreciate that.
Richard, let me jump in and follow Commissioner Fern's query on that, because I guess I want to make sure that we heard you right. The build out is actually 25 to 40 years and would not occur when the first phase of the project occurs, because I think that's what I heard you say relative to compatibility. Did I understand that?
Well, no, I mean, as a project like this takes years to fully come to fruition, and largely the phasing is going from east to west. The ballpark and eastern blocks first. So east of Market Street is first, the early phases. Everything west of Market then follows. And in those intervening years, everything west of Market, effectively as the site is today, and can be used for parking and circulation access and other informal forms of activation. But as the site develops, the various modes then become more diverse. And I think for the whole region, we're hoping that people become more comfortable with alternative modes of transportation too. And so the project anticipates those diverse forms: buses, shuttles, bicycles, scooters, walking, as all of those modes come into play. And so that diagram that we described that shows the percentage of access from Market Street all the way to Broadway demonstrates how all the modes would distribute quite evenly along that stretch.
And this is Noah Rosen with the applicant team. I just have maybe one more thing to add here. Given the importance of this issue, transportation and circulation to the site, though the details of those issues don't actually live in the design guidelines or the PDP. They have their own dedicated documents, which you can find in the draft DIR. So for the ballpark, it's the transportation management plan, or the TMP, and for the non-ballpark development, it's an outline of the TDM plan, the transportation demand management plan. So both those documents outline the circulation plans, capital improvements and programmatic improvements in much greater detail than we're discussing here.
And I understand that. No, I guess thank you for that. I think where I was going is that sometimes these TDM plans and the space required to have an organized TDM program do affect the public realm. And so I think that would need to be reflected in design guidelines, because, one of the things that I was thinking about is, it goes to one of Pete's comments, is that I just didn't see a lot of how the public realm was treated, particularly along the line. I saw there were right of ways, and we talked about trees and landscaping and lighting, but one of the questions I had was, what's the sidewalk hierarchy like? How does that look? Because that affects how the building's going to be situated and things of that nature. So, is the sidewalk on Market the same size as or the same width as the sidewalk on Myrtle, or are they different sizes? Because all those affect the development footprint, they affect the public realm. And so if you are making accommodations for ride share or scooter share or whatever it may be, that may need to be thought of in the public realm. That was the
understood. Yeah, the street cross sections are detailed in the PDP that was, I think, attached to Pete's staff report, and we have considered that hierarchy you're discussing.
Those are the questions I had, Chairman.
Okay. Commissioner Lamont?
Yeah. So I guess, Richard, if you could talk a little bit about just the parking in general, sort of the overall scope and access for patrons versus residents or workers. If you could just talk about that. The plans obviously show parking, at the lower levels or at the base of the buildings. So yeah, I'd just like to get a better feel for that.
And Pete, I might ask, can we post up a plan? I know we're talking a lot in words here. It would really be great if we had a plan that we could be talking to as these questions are being asked. Maybe Richard or Leon.
Yeah, if one of you want to pop up the site plan from your presentation, that would probably be helpful.
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Thank you. Great, thank you very much.
I might actually just go to a circulation diagram just to start, given the question is about access. As I was mentioning in the earlier response, the western half of the site, everything west of Market, for the first many years of the project is that surface parking, and then the pedestrian access, from downtown and Jack London, which would then largely focus for all the access on the eastern side as the first phases are developed. Once the project is fully established, the individual towers would have parking for those residents built into their bases. I believe the guidelines, and I'd need know what to verify, but the framework allows for the potential for a west side parking bank here to support the overall access needs for those ball game days. In the event that by the time the project is fully developed, that modes and preferences and haven't evolved that much, and there's still a lot of reliance on parking. So there's flexibility built in to establish that western block, which is adjacent to the more industrial edges of the port, to be that parking bay. Alternatively, there's individual parking for the residences, office uses, and hotel, all built within their individual parcels. And those would be, multi-level to accommodate the quantities that are required.
So with that in mind, are some of those floors, will they be able to convert, let's say that demand is not so high, to convert to other uses?
Yes, that's the intent, is that there's they're designed with the possibility with floor heights so that they can be converted to lobby uses, ground floor uses, and alternative uses. So the proportions in the floor layout is established in the guidelines to allow both of the functions to occur. So there's flexibility there.
Right. And then as far as like unloading and loading of semis, let's say for a major event, a concert, it looked like that there was some access on the perimeter of the stadium that goes below grade. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. So I'll show this diagram here. So orange in this upper left diagram here is vehicular. So, and the thickness of the diagram equates to capacity and volume. So thinner the line, the less traffic is anticipated, thicker, the more traffic. Primary vehicular entries for servicing, as well as visitors and residents and game day users would be on MLK, as well as Market Street. For players, for servicing, for VIP and all of that access that goes under Athletics Way, the route is as follows: come down Market Street and then enter into one of the two vehicular paseos that Leon had shared. Right, there's two different formats. There's the vehicular paseo, which has pedestrian ramps that flank the buildings and a ramp down below Athletics Way in between. And there's the fully pedestrianized paseos that have stairs and switchback ramps and vegetation planting to make those pedestrian environments. But the vehicles would come on, service vehicles and loading vehicles would enter below Athletics Way on one of those two passages, access all the servicing needs then below, and then exit out the other, and then connect back to Market Street.
So it looks like, given that they can access the perimeter, that there should be plenty of capacity for, like, let's say, I understand like Chase Center's had some issues with their loading and unloading of semis during concerts. And so with this sort of thought, there should be plenty of capacity. Does that sound about right?
Yes, that's the plan is, and there's a lot going on under the ballpark. There's a lot of space down there, but there's also a lot of uses. And so all of the vehicular tracking diagrams have been performed to show that the trucks can come in and do a counterclockwise rotation and meet all the turns and access to the loading. And that's a key dimension to have worked out. And that was set up as the plans for the ballpark were evolved.
And so with that, do you envision like, let's say the workers on those special events, not necessarily vendors or the retail, but the actual, let's say, for example, union workers who are building the stages and moving the equipment, would they have access to park there, do you think, or are they kind of on their own?
I can chime in on that. This is Noah again. There'd be very limited parking underneath that Athletics Way service area. It would be primarily used for players, maybe about 100 spaces. So employee parking would not be located under there in large numbers.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to get a sense of the scope and potential impact. So no, this is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lamone. So let me start with a couple of my comments and we can sort of go through this. First, I want to thank Pete for a very detailed staff report with a lot of questions in my mind that I think this hearing basically has brought out. And so anyway, so thank you, Pete. And I think we share a lot of the same views that you do. So I'm going to be very specific about some of them, and I'm not sure whom might be best to respond to them. Let me just sort of talk for a minute about the height and the assumptions there. And I'm going to ask Pete, and then I don't know whether it's Richard or Leon or Noah who can talk about the tower assumptions here, because want to ask about them. The use of density bonus is assumed to be a given part of the height that is being granted. That's a question for you, Pete? Or would we see density bonuses that would push the heights that are proposed here beyond what is being proposed?
So as it stands right now, the project is fully baked in on this maximum unit count. If they wanted to alter that, there's CEQA implications to that. So
Okay.
they would actually need to go in and open up CEQA again. So that would be, a revision to that process, at least in the form of an addendum and further analysis. As I noted with the general plan amendment they're asking for, the PUD kind of locks in what the development proposal is. So that is the project. So that is taking into consideration the number of units. If there's units built on site, it would be part of that 3,000 for any affordable units. Density bonuses, it would need to come forward right now, but they're basically creating a PUD that says this is what the building envelopes are going to be.
Okay.
At the maximums.
Great, terrific. And then second part of that, Pete, is I know there's been discussion on the deal points about the affordability and the 450 units. There's no resolution or staff view on the whether they be on site.
That is an ongoing negotiation right now. That is being negotiated with the group that's doing the development agreement, and I'm just staying in the loop.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so let me pose this question to whom can address it. I want to talk a little bit about the height and the assumptions there. Who would that be on the design team?
I think it depends on the question, but it would probably be myself or Noah.
Okay, so in this region, there is no ability to actually do skinny floor plates in any economic model. I've been practicing in this region for almost 4 decades, and anytime that proper project type has come forward, the project has never lived. So I question that relative to the 600 and 400 feet that is being proposed. With that said, the other thing that I'm sort of curious about relative to, and we'll describe it in the broader terms of equity, that super high rises, because their cost premium, generally become beyond market rate and become luxury. And I guess the question that I would pose to either Leon or Noah is that the strategy that we're talking about here relative to what those mean?
Is the strategy to develop super luxury, super premium units on site? Is that the question?
I'm asking the question that super high-rise, small floor plate buildings precipitate luxury condominium projects.
Actually, Commissioner, I can take that. Dave Cavill here with the A's and with the development team. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's certainly a valid point, but I think our perspective is that the 600 feet in the larger towers are something that provides some flexibility to the developer and to the project. And we feel that it can be done in a respectful way for the entire success of the project.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Thank you. I realize it's your point of view. I will tell you, based on lengthy experience, that's never going to happen. And I'm concerned about the heights there. The second part of this is the city went through a very elaborate process on Brooklyn Basin using type 3A construction. I think the density for many of us on the commission is not an issue. Why is there not the ability to actually look at that as a reasonable alternative relative to the scale? Because I am in support of what the staff report is describing is the heights are exceptionally too high. I think the bigger thing for me beyond the equity, and Dave, what you might believe is the developable capacity, it basically pulls the core and the focus of the downtown of the city to the waterfront and not into the middle of the city, which I think is not a particularly effective city building process. So I'm posing the question relative to why I feel like the heights that you're proposing are beyond what is reasonable to assume. I know Commissioner Lamone mentioned this earlier. I worry about the scoreboard and the views of the scoreboard from those units that are facing behind home plate and the glare associated with them. And in general, if you look at Oracle Park, the amount of light in the air around that stadium is actually pretty significant, and you were proposing a very dense project. I understand, certainly, in order to facilitate creating a stadium. So I just want to add that. I do agree with some of the comments of the speakers that I think the project with the turning basin reflected in this within the next 7 years is a given part of it. I think that what I've heard and what I understand is that whether it's a 50-50 chance of doing, I do think that it's one that I think is worthy of making sure that we understand what the implications are. I think Commissioner Fern really was touching on that associated with the waterfront character and what that alternative would do. With that, let me see if I have a couple more points that I wanted to make. So I guess I want to sort of come back to my fellow commissioners, and Pete, maybe you can sort of help us through this process here. What I've heard in the hearing and what I've shared is there seem to still be a lot of loose issues that are really not resolved. I understand the importance of moving this forward for the A's to be able to take the next step, whether it's in Oakland or it's in Las Vegas, in whatever their deal might be. And we're reviewing this solely on the basis of design. But with that said, I sort of feel like we have not been afforded the seeing what those variations might be as we typical in design review, in an effort to have the commission be prepared to understand that and not just act on it. So Pete, maybe you could provide some insight into what that process might be relative to what you understand the path would be on this project.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify the question. So are you essentially asking next steps?
I am asking next steps because, as I said, I think there's a fair amount of loose ends here, particularly based on the testimony and based on a lot of things that are reflected in your staff report. How would DRC be able to review that in a subsequent hearing in order to be able to field the issues that have been raised as part of the testimony or other issues that you flagged versus it moving to the commission directly?
So, we are trying to move forward at a pretty expedited rate. I would expect that the A's will take the comments today, make revisions to the documents, and then resubmit those to staff for review. Those documents will be posted on the city's website through Excella. At least I've actually created a project page that keeps the preliminary development plan and associated guidelines on there. So as revisions come in, they will be posted there. Anybody is free to take a look at those and provide any additional comments. If the committee does want to see it back, you can certainly make that request. That's within your right. Often on a lot of these projects, we will take direction and incorporate those in. And if we feel that direction has been achieved, then we will take it forward to the commission with an explanation of that. Maybe sometimes it'd be a few outstanding additional comments that we have that they need to incorporate in or add as a condition of approval. But, that's often how we've dealt with in the past on some other projects. Some other projects come back again.
Okay. Commissioner Fern or Lamone, other thoughts here as to where we are relative to the discussion on the proposed project?
Yeah, since I won't be on DRC for the next meeting, I just wanted to give some feedback. Overall, this is a really exciting opportunity for the city and for the waterfront. And, there are issues related to the coexistence with port facilities and port operations. But as long as the A's are able to work it out, I'm excited about this project. And looking at the sort of the thought process that has gone into the design of the stadium and the overall sort of feel and placemaking of the entire district, I think it's been tastefully done, with a lot of thought and and sensitivity to the character of Oakland. Sure, there are a lot of things to work out, and I think the public has made that very clear. But overall, I'm excited about this opportunity. So wish everyone the best of luck on continuing to move this forward.
Thanks, Commissioner Lamont. Commissioner Fern.
Yeah, so I do agree with the chairman. I think there are some obviously some outstanding items that need to be handled. I just related to the guidelines themselves, just a couple of comments that I had that I just wanted to state for the record. I do, and if again, I've read this thing about 3 times. So if I miss something, let me know. But I think that there does need to be some guidelines, some setback guidelines for residential uses on the ground floor. A lot of the guidelines kind of talk about that residential uses are going to be allowed on the ground floor, but I think there needs to be something stated kind of what that would look like if there really are residential uses on the ground floor. I didn't see kind of lighting guidelines for Myrtle Street, and given the fact that Myrtle Street is kind of the back of House Street, just want to make sure that this street doesn't start to feel kind of like a dark alley. So I think that's something we just want to state. And I do, obviously, I think, Pete, your comments I support in terms of, increasing the width of the Bay Trail and recognizing the street, reorganizing the street layout and so on and so forth. Related to the tower guidelines, I do think, regardless of the height, and I also feel that the height is a little outsized in this location. To Commissioner Manis's or Chair Manis's point, I think that we don't want to create kind of 2 downtowns, and we're trying to generate activity in our own downtown. And so I want to be careful about kind of what we're doing in this realm. I obviously want a note of activity here. I'm not opposed to height in general, but I think competing with height with the tallest buildings in downtown doesn't feel quite right to me. And so I do think that we need to establish some kind of tower design guidelines similar to what we have done in the downtown related to base, middle and the crowns, on some level to kind of give some guidance to how we want these buildings to look. And I'm just throwing out those as examples. I'm not saying that necessarily needs to be the case. What we're seeing in the rendering certainly, they don't show that. So, but I do think there need to be those need to be spoken to. I think in terms of keeping this on track, or if it's expedited, I understand that. I think as perhaps a compromise. There's always a DRC summary section in the staff reports that the commission gets. I think that would be a good way for at least the three of us to check to make sure that what was kind of stated here and what was kind of raised here was adequately addressed. And then Chair Manis, there's always the opportunity if we're not satisfied at commission to bring it back to DRC for anything that may be outstanding at that time. So that would kind of be my recommendation. And then obviously this is the PDP. There's still the FDPs that would be coming before the commission as well for further refinement, before, shovels start hitting the ground. So I think there are a number of ways to have some checks as this moves forward. So I would be supportive of that if others are.
So well said, Commissioner Fern. I think you captured that, and I want to assure the design team and Dave Cavall that to Commissioner Lamone's points, we all want the A's and the associated development to succeed. I think there is probably a great desire on our part to be effective in that. With that said, the things that we have heard at this hearing, which give us all a little heartburn relative to either grade crossings or turning basins or building heights or stuff like that. The design team in terms of the ground plane has done, Richard, a very thoughtful job and a lot of the stuff. And I think what we are all trying to emphasize is that this is a real Oakland infill. It's a very important infill. I think Commissioner Fern echoed my comment, which is that we don't really want a second downtown, which is where this is going. We don't have a problem with the scope of the uses that are needed to finance and fund a ballpark village. And I think then with that, and I want to turn it back to Pete for a moment. I think the first question for that I would pose to you, Pete, is that the material that was presented today by the design team will be posted following this hearing.
That is correct.
Okay, terrific. The second part of that, I think, and Commissioner Fern described it. I think none of us want to be an impediment to the process here. We are a recommending body in this case, both through DRC to the Planning Commission, but we do want all the issues basically laid out on the table so that we understand the trade-offs or accommodations we're making with regard to the variety of things that are there that I just think that, and this is Dave, I will have to say this is an unusual part of the process here, that this got so far down the road and that the commission and the DRC were never part of the dialogue. It was your decision perhaps not to do that, but my heartburn is that it's too baked, and we didn't really have any ability to basically share what the public might be. You may have gone out, but the commission or the DRC is really part of the process of trying to make sure the public hears all the issues, and we heard a lot of them. So let me then summarize it, Commissioner Lamone and Fern, if we're in this place. Pete, one, they're going to get posted. Second, we would like a process that you could help outline for us that will allow us to be able to either have another DRC, or as Commissioner Fern says, as we've done in the past, move this through the commission and bring it back to DRC relative to a response on some of the items we flagged in an effort to move the process forward. And so I will rely upon you now to help sort of guide us in what you think the most effective way to deal with this, the sort of iterations that we've all described.
Yeah, so often that has been the case where there's a project that's approved and commission moves it forward and basically adds a condition saying these further refinements shall be included into the design guidelines, and those get brought back to the design review committee for discussion. That's certainly been the case in the past. Hopefully that with the comments put forward today, we can get a package that responds to the comments that I've raised in the staff report, plus additional comments today that are focused on, design guidelines and PDP issues. And hopefully we can get that all incorporated in, and we could bring it forward to the Planning Commission and have it in a summary explaining what was incorporated in, so we can move it forward, and that doesn't have to be a concern.
Okay, so that would mean this sort of visual variations on some of the things we've talked about. The other thing that I would request too of the design team, that if this item will get moved to a commission hearing, that every one of the visuals that's going to be presented at the hearing is delivered to the staff at a time so that the public and both the commission have adequate time to see it. It's, you certainly raised the bar on the graphics from what was in the submittal, and that's very much appreciated, but being able to see them at the hearing and not before, and being able to understand that, I think, is a critical part of that. So let me just sort of take a minute and ask Richard or Leon if you have any questions or any things that you perhaps want to share with us relative to the comments that we've shared with you.
No questions from me, commissioners. I would just say that we're grateful for the feedback. I hope you see that we are taking this effort very seriously. We want to get it right. We want it to be a loved place. It's projects like this are challenging in any case. but let alone, with the uniqueness of a ballpark. And so, we are trying to thread the needle and build the right set of mixes with the right character and feel, and a diversity of attractions that make this something that all of Oaklanders and folks from around the region want to experience, even if they're not A's fans. But if you are an A's fan, it really will be something, I think, very deeply meaningful. So appreciate all of your feedback. It's all taken to heart, and we'll build as much of a response as we can in our next issue.